I think what our policymakers in Europe are trying to tell us is that if we just invest enough into missile defense, and maybe they don't know better, right? I don't think they're necessarily malicious in that. I think they're just uninformed and frankly a bit stupid. But they're bringing across this message that if we just have enough, right, the Russian missile threat will cease to exist. That's just not the case, right? Even if we also achieve 90% interception rates, which, let's be honest, that will not happen. Absolutely not, because Russia will have a lot easier time oversaturating our missile defenses. Their missile capabilities are also more advanced, right? Iskander, for example, the 9723 short-range ballistic missile that is launched from the Iskander missile system, that can maneuver quite aggressively mid-air, at least compared to Iranian ballistic missiles. And that maneuvering really makes it more difficult to intercept it, right? Because then the interceptor also has to account for the maneuvering of the projectile that it's homing in at. And so, but let's say even if we get 90%, which I think probably in reality would be closer to 60 to 70. But even if it's 90%, if Russia will launch 1,000 missiles at us, which, let's be honest, they will do, that means there's still 100 that are getting through. And we're just not honest about that, I feel like, in Europe, at least our policymakers. I know the militaries know that, and they're trying to also bring across the message to their policymakers. But for one reason or another, that message is then not translated into procurement priorities. Because if it was, I think we would emphasize more our own counter-strike capabilities, such as Ukraine is doing right now, instead of just, trying to go all in on missile defense, which, again, in my view, is a losing game.
That's really interesting. Maybe one thing to clarify, because I always thought that maybe something that would be a limiting factor in this, in the hypothetical scenario that you're talking about of Russia, overwhelming and attacking at scale and overwhelming European air defenses. I always thought that ballistic missiles were extremely expensive. So that Russia wouldn't really be able to do that, or it wouldn't be really able to do that for that long. But maybe I'm wrong on that.
No, so again, PPP plays a huge role here, purchasing price power parity. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know exactly what PPP stands for. But right, like the fact that Russia can just produce a lot cheaper in their own country than we can produce in ours, that plays a huge role. So I recently seen an estimate that a short-range ballistic missile, for the Iskander system, costs Russia to produce somewhere around $400,000. In all honesty, I'm also not the best one to, not that much into defense economics. To me, that number seems plausible. But let's say there is, an uncertainty of 50%. Let's say the real price is 600,000 or 200 to 600,000, maybe even 800,000. Honestly, maybe let's make it even 1 million, right? Because it doesn't matter in that sense. Because American Patriot interceptors, the recent procurement price for those in export contracts is around 3.5 to 4 million US dollars per piece. So at the very least, right, even if an Iskander missile, a short-range ballistic missile, costs you 1 million to produce, which probably is a heavy overestimation, and probably is a lot less, right? It's still 1 to 4. So we would spend 4 times more in missile defense than Russia spends on the offensive capability. If it's indeed 400,000, which the report noted, then it's 1 to 10. So that's really bad. And then the other thing that's also really important to mention here, one interceptor, again has like a certain percentage of percentage chance of killing the incoming projectile. Let's say for a modern Patriot PAC-3 MSE interceptor, right? Very modern, very good system. Let's say that's 80%. So if I launch one at the incoming ballistic missile, I have an 80% chance of intercepting it. Of course, I can allocate 2 interceptors per target. Then I bring up the overall chance of interception to 96%. And if I allocate 3 interceptors, then my overall likelihood of interception will approach 100%. But again, right, allocating 3 interceptors for one incoming ballistic missile, that's very, very expensive and that will drain your arsenal extremely fast. So basically, in Europe, you then also have a choice, and Israel faced the same dilemma, right? Um, that either you allocate one interceptor per incoming target, knowing that there is, then a fairly plausible chance that it will get through, or I allocate more than one and bring up my likelihood of interception, but then I also train my arsenal a lot faster. So basically, you have a choice between a lot of lower chance intercepts or a significantly lower number of high certainty intercepts. But no matter what, missile defense is more expensive than long range strike, and that's why our policy in Europe is, I think, so unfortunate.
So why do you think that the policies in Europe are the way they are? Do you think that it's just a much that it's kind of appealing to maybe look at Israel and imagine we can also shield ourselves in an impenetrable air defense shield, and it's much less comfortable to admit that it might not be possible and consider thinking about investing more into strike capability and these issues? Why do you think that the policy issues are there?
Oh, you basically nailed it, right? I think it's very attractive for European policymakers, and in fact, they do that all the time, right? They point at Israel and then they say we need an Iron Dome for Germany or for Europe. I mean, Trump's Golden Dome, right, is also heavily inspired by Israel's Iron Dome. I obviously, again, like this speaks to the fact that those policymakers, they very often don't even understand Israeli missile defense, because again, right, the Iron Dome, as I explained earlier, that is only one part of those of the overall missile defense architecture, and only the lowest tier, and I think the least relevant one for European policymakers, also American policymakers, right? So, but yeah, it's political, right? I think it's a lot easier to invest in a capability that where even in the name it's called defense, right? Missile defense, it's a defensive capability. We're not threatening anyone with that. So it's very easy to make the case for that. Whereas to invest into a capability called conventional long range strike, right? Why do you want to invest into something that strikes the other side? That's offensive. That's bad. We're not offensive, right? We're just trying to protect ourselves. I think that's where the issue lies in a lot of countries. I mean, Germany made it abundantly clear, right? Like there you had that, especially under the last government, you constantly had this discourse about offensive and defensive capabilities, and that we are interested in providing Ukraine with defensive capabilities, but we would never provide them with offensive capabilities. And of course, the same then counts for us, right? Like we don't want to be a threat to Russia, so we have to invest into defensive capabilities, because if we invest into offensive capabilities, that may make things even worse, right? So I think that's where that, and then I mean, probably the military also has some role to play in that, right? I mean, I I think it's also fair to be a bit critical of them. Again, take Germany as the example. Germany has invested some 10 billion euros into missile defense since February 2022, and only a few hundred millions into long range strike. Um, and I think the military, the Air Force, they should have pushed back harder also, right? I mean, they were happy to take the money for obvious reasons, but it would have also been in their responsibility to really make the case that you're reaching a point of diminishing returns where it's much smarter now to invest in our own offensive strike capabilities, because that will improve our defense, our deterrence much more than keep going all in on missile defense. And again, I don't have perfect insights. I don't know. Maybe decision makers, military decision makers, try to make the case. I mean, I've spoken to them, and they say, yeah, we would like more money for offensive strike capabilities. But maybe then it was also, your responsibility to make that case a bit more effectively and guide those policymakers in the right direction. But of course, that's easy said from the outside. We don't know exactly how it looked like.
If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter. Station 0. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about the major threat that Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, is facing, why he's increasingly likely to be defeated in the next year's elections, why his new challenger is not at all who you would expect, and why it might be a lesson for politicians everywhere. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description.